Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. There's been some news reports about Coca-Cola being pressured into moving back to using cane sugar for sweetening all of their regular sugared sodas. The rationale isn't really been given. And there's a lot of talk about why is Coca-Cola being pressured into moving back to using cane sugar for their beverages, with quotes being attributed to various politicians indicating that it is somehow going to be better. But what does it mean to be better? Is it better for your health? Is it better because it tastes better? What does it mean that is somehow going to be better? Is there an actual scientific reason for going back and using cane sugar versus high fructose corn syrups or the high fructose syrups? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
This is where we have to start kind of delving into the pseudoscience versus the science when it relates to a lot of this metabolite issue, particularly when it comes to the sweeteners and the sugars that are there, and the hysteria that is kind of governing the idea about carbohydrates and the idea about sugars within our diet within the year 2025. And it's something that we've talked about previously in the fact that sugar has become the boogeyman within most of the dietary issues. And within that, one of the bigger boogeymans within the whole entire sugar discussion is high fructose corn syrup. What is high fructose corn syrup and why might it be bad? And it's a why might it be bad? Because if we really want to be kind of frank here, and we can be very short within this podcast episode, within this discussion, the answer is it better for us health-wise in terms of what the science says? The answer is no. There's no scientific evidence out there that says that fructose syrup is worse for you than sucrose in terms of all of the health issues that come into play if we start looking at health issues strictly coming from sugar consumption. And that's the caveat here, strictly coming from sugar consumption. When we start looking at and delving into the metabolism of everything that's going on and the chemistry of everything that's going on, both sucrose as well as the high fructose syrups, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or other types of high fructose syrups, have the same base sugar units. That is, they both contain glucose and fructose. The difference that we're going to see within there comes into the chemistry of how the molecules are put together and how the molecules are arranged within the actual structures that we see, where there's two big differences that we're going to see. One of the big differences is the percentages of those two units, where normal sucrose, normal table sugar, is about a 50-50 split. That 50-50 split means that 50% of the molecule is made up of fructose, the other 50% of the molecule is made up of glucose. The high fructose corn syrup is going to have slightly different ratios between the glucose and the fructose, where there'll be a slightly higher percentage of fructose and a slightly lower percentage of glucose. That is one of the key in terms of the chemical difference that we're going to see and how it might lead to differences in some metabolic effects that can come about. The biggest chemical difference between high fructose corn syrup or high fructose syrup and sucrose is that sucrose tends to exist within what's referred as an anhydrous condition. That means that it's without water. And that's where table sugar gets its crystalline structure, its crystal shape. It's not stuck in water, which means that it's a solid, as opposed to the corn syrup or the high fructose syrup, which is going to be a liquid. Now, if I put that table sugar into liquid, it's going to be hydrated, and that's going to cause differences to take place within the chemical bonds, very similar to what we see within the high fructose corn syrups or high fructose syrups, is going to exist in a hydrated state. That means it's with water. In that hydrated, refined state, what we're able to do is we're able to manipulate the percentages. In that percentages, what we can do is we can manipulate it so we go between a 50-50 split to now having a 55 fructose split or a 42% glucose split. And those differences is going to lead to different chemical properties of the syrup. That different chemical properties of the syrup is going to lead to different uses for the various types of high fructose syrups within manufacturing of goods. When we start looking at this percentage splits, a lower percentage split, that 42% split is going to be used for doing a lot of the baking. So if we look at any of the sucrose solutions, the corn syrup solutions that are used for baking purposes, it's going to have a 42 high fructose corn syrup. Whereas with the sodas, with the beverages, such as what a lot of the news reports is discussing, is going to be using that 55 fructose split. And that 55 fructose split is going to allow it to have very similar taste and very similar chemical properties to what we see with normal sucrose. One of the things that we start looking at, though, is within this liquid solution, within the hydrated condition, that sucrose, that molecule is made up of glucose and fructose, will start to dissociate. They'll start to break apart within the solution itself, which will lead to higher percentages of fructose combining, higher percentages of glucose combining, or getting a dissociated release of glucose, where if we say take a bottle of soda made with high fructose corn syrup, or take a can of soda made of high fructose corn syrup and compare it to a can or a bottle made with just regular cane sugar, and we're to use a glucose test strip on it, the sodas with the high fructose syrup would test positive for having glucose within the bottle or in the can, whereas the one that is using normal cane sugar would not. And it's simply because of the dissociation, reassociation, what's referred to as the equilibrium reaction taking place within the beverage, is going to allow for, in the normal cane sugar, not to have a dissociation release of glucose, whereas with the high fructose corn syrup, there can be a dissociated release of glucose within there. This is where we start looking at some of the labeling, some of the ideas about the added sugars that are within products. Once again, this goes back to the whole boogeyman discussion we had previously as relates to what is actually beneficial versus not beneficial for a macronutrient load. One of the things that people start discussing, particularly within the debate as relates to this high fructose corn syrup, high fructose syrup versus the regular sucrose, is the relative newness, put quotes around that, to the high fructose syrups relative to the sucrose. And that's correct in terms of historical accuracy, but it's not necessarily correct in terms of physiology. And that goes back to the fact that if I put sucrose into a liquid and I start to manipulate that liquid, I can start to form a change within the fructose to glucose concentrations, as well as the dissociations taking place. We also see it based off of the fructose load of various fruits that would be added to some of the things that would be consumed prior to this quote unquote manufacturing of the high fructose syrups. And so once again, historically speaking, that is correct, that high fructose corn syrup is a relatively new quote unquote invention in terms of food science. However, fructose has been around for long periods of time, and sweeter tasting fruits tend to have higher amounts of fructose than less sweet tasting fruits. And we are drawn towards consuming fructose at higher levels than we are towards glucose based off of sweet response if we happen to have a bliss point that favors sweetness. With that kind of idea there, one of the things that comes into play within the discussion, independent of the desire for consuming things and that bliss point reward response, is some of the notion that sugar itself can have addictive properties to it. And what we do know is that, yes, if I happen to have a bliss point for sweetness, I can get a slight psychological attraction towards consuming sweet foods, slight attraction towards consuming sugars, but we don't have the same physiological and psychological withdrawal symptoms that we have from other things that are addictive. And so we can kind of ignore that as one of the discussion points in terms of the high fructose versus the normal natural sugar. And once again, put quotes around natural sugar. When we start looking at the science of everything in terms of what's worse for you, if we start looking at the idea about the metabolism of what's going on in terms of the metabolic byproducts, in terms of the metabolism that leads to secondary chemicals within the body, there's a couple of issues that come up when we start looking at this idea about the fructose within the sugars and what it can do metabolically that we don't see with glucose. And one of the things that fructose does, independent of any hormone signaling, is that fructose will trigger lipogenesis. It will trigger the production of lipids. And one of the sites that it can do this at is within the liver. And that's where we have to start worrying about metabolic issues with diets that have higher amounts of fructose within it in terms of triggering that lipid transition or lipid metabolic responses, as well as the reactive oxidative species responses within the liver, leading to what's usually referred to as non-alcoholic fatty acid liver syndrome. But we get the same or a similar effect with consuming sucrose in excess. And so one of the things we have to worry about here is what is the point at which we have to start worrying about differences between the high fructose syrup and the natural sugar in terms of that fatty acid liver issue. And there is no clear indication for what is the point that we have to worry about it. We do know that with higher fructose consumption, we get higher amounts of lipogenesis, not just within the liver, but also within adipose tissue throughout the body, which leads to differential responses within fat cell signals. It also leads to differential responses within liver hormone signals. And those differences in changes in hormone signals is one of the instigators for inflammation responses and chronic inflammation responses that are associated with lifestyle diseases, which may be one of the reasons why Coca-Cola is getting pressured to stop using the high fructose syrups and go back to the cane sugars. But we still have to worry about the sugar consumption, once again, if we're strictly looking at this based off of sugar consumption. And one of the problems with the debate is that the debate tends to ignore the high complexity within the multifactorial responses, the fitness and fatness continuum issues as relates to non-communicable diseases, and the onset of issues. This is where one of the things that people like to point out, as I stated earlier, is the idea that within the solutions, we can start having dissociation of glucose from the sucrose molecule in that high fructose syrup. And that can lead to higher amounts of glucose in circulation within the blood, which can lead to insulin spiking, as can happen if I consume greater than 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass, or about a half gram to about 2/3 of a gram per pound of sugar, of sucrose within a meal within an hour. And so if I am looking at like a normal can of soda, that normal can of soda is only between 20 and about 30 grams of sugar. And that's not enough by itself to instigate any type of insulin response to the consumption of the sugars. One of the biggest misconceptions that's out there, one of the biggest misinformation pitches out there for the people who want to look at the issue of diabetic conditions solely off of what happens to my body due to dietary changes and circulating levels of glucose. If I do not consume that high level of sugar, greater than the 0.5 to 0.6 grams per pound or 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass, I'm not going to get an insulin spike from the consumption of the sugars. If I'm consuming other products that have sugars in it with that soda, then I start having to worry about the additive effect of all of the sugars that can get me to that threshold that will lead to the spike in insulin. But that's not a lot of what the debate comes into play. A lot of the debate coming into play, yes, has to deal with diabetic issues, has to deal with body weight issues, even though we do not see differences in body weight changes for individuals consuming the fructose syrup versus individuals consuming the cane sugar. We do not see it in the animal studies that look at dietary changes and body mass changes based off of the consumption of the fructose syrups versus the cane sugar. There is some indication, and once again, it's not very definitive, that there is change that will take place within the microbiome of the intestines with consumption of the high fructose corn syrups, the high fructose syrups, relative to the consumption of the cane sugars, with the indication that the high fructose syrups will act as a metabolic disruptor. And because they'll act as a metabolic disruptor, they increase the likelihood for non-communicable diseases due to the interaction between the microbiome, the bacterium, and the microorganisms living inside of the gut, and our normal immune response and normal inflammation responses throughout the day, throughout our normal life. This has led some to posit a hypothesis that the consumption of the high fructose syrups can lead to inflammation responses all by themselves. The problem is that there is very limited evidence to support that idea. Once again, it goes back to the speculation that it is strictly about the sugar consumption within the diet causing the non-communicable disease onset, especially for the type 2 diabetes that seems to be the hallmark of discussion when we discuss the non-communicable disease. There is a speculation that the consumption of high fructose syrup leads to changes in the microbiome, which triggers inflammation, which leads to an increased allergic response for individuals who consume the high fructose syrups. There is no empirical evidence that definitively shows that hypothesis is true. Out of all of the metabolic effects that have been attributed to the high fructose syrup, the only one that empirically has been shown through analysis to increase a risk for issues, the only one is on inflammatory marker, and in particular the inflammatory marker referenced as C-reactive protein. There is indication for favorability in terms of effectiveness or effect size towards high fructose corn syrup or high fructose syrup for triglycerides, for low density lipoproteins, for for total cholesterol issues. But the skew on the effectiveness does not negate the no difference, which means that we cannot state that definitively there is a metabolic difference. The reason why we have to look at those issues is because of one of the impacts that processing of fructose at the liver can do is to increase triglyceride levels and increase LDL levels and increase total cholesterol levels based off of changes in metabolic functions within the liver. But we don't see empirical evidence to definitively support that hypothesis as being true. So there is no real metabolic effect that stipulates the impact that high fructose corn syrup or high fructose syrup would have, different from what we would see from just excessive consumption of the sucrose. Well, what about weight? What about body composition? Once again, there's no definitive difference in between the sucrose consumption and the high fructose syrup consumption. Within the continuum, there is some favorability towards the high fructose syrup solution relative to the sucrose consumption, but you cannot negate the no difference within that continuum. So we cannot empirically state that consumption of the high fructose syrups will lead to excessive amounts of fat mass gain or excessive weight gain. There is, once again, that metabolic effect that fructose consumption has on fat metabolism, leading to increased amounts of lipogenesis, but it doesn't seem to lead to accumulation of fat mass in excess that we would not see from the consumption of the sucrose. And that's because the sucrose will also have the fructose within it that, if not metabolized into the other sugars that we need within the body, can lead to that lipogenesis, that production of the lipids. So why is it that we're having this discussion? Why is it that we're having this debate? What is the idea that this is somehow going to be better if we use cane sugar? This goes into some of the comments that I hear from people who travel around the world and drink the United States version of the sodas versus the sodas they get in other countries that use cane sugar, where they stipulate that it tastes different or it somehow tastes better. That is a subjective rating, and part of it deals with that bliss point response. The other part has to deal with the relative level of sweetness that we might get from the sucrose versus the fructose solutions, the fructose syrups, and how it is being interpreted within our brain, within our cerebral cortex, particularly within what's referred as the gustatory cortex, and our subjective understanding of what we like relative to our bliss. So it will taste different. And part of that different taste may be a novelty that we want. And that novelty, that newness, may lead to us assuming that it's tasting better, even though it really doesn't taste better. But when we start looking at this, we have to look at it from a scientific perspective and the health impact that it might have on our body. And once again, there's no empirical evidence out there that stipulates 100% always true that the consumption of the high fructose syrups will lead to health issues at a higher likelihood than consuming sucrose. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you get a little bit out of the brief discussion we had as relates to the difference between sucrose and high fructose corn syrup or high fructose syrup, and why it may not be better in terms of this conversion that Coca-Cola is being pressured to make as it relates to its beverage productions. If you like what I'm putting out there, please make sure you give us that big 5-star rating, give us that big thumbs up, tell us that we're doing a good job. Please make sure you have subscribed to follow us here on the podcast as well as on the YouTube channel with the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post to Instagram and to Threads. Please make sure you're sharing with all of your friends and family. Please stay tuned for more discussions in terms of some of the misconceptions we have about how the human body works, as well as how we can go about living a healthier life.